That's not important. Actually, yes, it is. Okay, before I start reading, I'm going to say this. I created an Evil Gray Stripe AU. If you want to hear more about it, just like, sub, and comment if you want to know. Thank you. Chapter 5. Is this 5? That's where we're at, right? Chapter 5. My voice is dead. Give me a second. Graywing headed for the cave entrance, but halted when he saw Dewyleaf and Twisted Branch returning, only heartbeats after they had left. Both were covered in snow and stopped to shake their pelts. "There's a blizzard out there," Twisted Branch announced. "We won't be able to catch anything until it's over." Dewyleaf gave a snort of disgust. "The wind nearly blew me off the mountain." Quiet Rain padded to Graywing's side. "You can't leave in weather like this," she meowed, her voice sharp with anxiety. Graywing understood how worried she must be about Jagged Peak, especially now that the snow had set in. "I can try—" "No," Quiet Rain interrupted. "Do you think I want all my kids to freeze to death?" "She's right." Stoneteller approached and touched Quiet Rain's ear with her nose. "Jagged Peak will find shelter, and so will Shaded Moss and his cats. You won't fall any further behind by waiting until the storm is over." Graywing's paws itched with impatience as the day continued, snowflakes outside whirling like white feathers out of a gray sky. By the time the storm blew itself out, the sun was setting behind the mountains in a dull red glow. Sharp Hill and Hollow Tree went out to hunt, but Graywing knew that it was too late for him to start his journey. Grief and apprehension had settled over the cave like a low cloud. Every cat feared the worst for Jagged Peak. Graywing could only hope that Stoneteller was right, and his little brother had been able to find shelter. His mother bore the waiting with quiet dignity, though her eyes were dark pools of pain. Graywing padded to where she crouched near the cave entrance. "It doesn't seem fair that you should lose all your kits," he murmured, sitting beside her. "I have no choice," Quiet Rain sighed, "and I still have Fluttering Bird near me beneath her pelt of stones." Graywing leaned closer to his mother so that his fur brushed hers, and sat with her as the light from the gray screen of falling water faded to darkness. His heart felt like it might burst with grief. The sound of paw steps roused him, and he saw Hollow Tree and Sharp Hail returning, their legs and belly fur plastered with snow. Hollow Tree was carrying a small, scrawny bird. "Graywing, you should have this," she meowed, dropping it in front of him. "It will give you the strength to follow Jagged Peak." "I can't," Graywing protested, with a glance toward his tribe mates deeper inside the cave. "No cat has eaten today." Sharp Hail pushed the bird closer to Graywing with one paw. "And this miserable thing won't fill one cat, let alone the whole tribe." "You need it," Stoneteller agreed, appearing from the shadows. "None of us would begrudge you a mouthful." "Thank you," Graywing mewed. He gulped down the bird in a few bites, then went to his sleeping hollow. Even though he knew he needed the rest for his journey, it took a long time for him to sleep. Curled up with the noise of the waterfall in his ears, he wondered drowsily if this was the last time he would ever hear it. Toward dawn he sank into deeper sleep, and woke to the sound of a cat padding past him. Turning his head, he spotted Stoneteller heading toward the cave entrance, where she sat and stared into the thunderous water. Graywing went to join her. As he sat down at her side, Stoneteller glanced at him. "I don't know if I did the right thing by sending so many cats away," she admitted, "but the vision of the sun trail seemed to offer a way out of the agony of seeing my tribe starve to death in the long cold season." Her voice was quiet, almost as if she was talking to herself. Graywing hardly knew what to say. "None of us knows what the future holds," he mewed at last. "We can only trust our instincts." Stoneteller dipped her head in acknowledgment. "We'll miss you, Graywing." "I didn't want to leave," Graywing confessed, "but now I know there's something I must do. I promise that I'll find Jagged Peak and take him to join the others in their new home." Light began filtering through the waterfall, and Graywing heard the sounds of his tri-mates stirring. One by one they gathered around him and Stoneteller. "Remember to be careful where you're putting your paws," Reliance were advised. "This fresh snow could be hiding all sorts of dangers." Not a kit, Graywing thought, though he didn't speak the words aloud. He realized that the elders only wanted to make sure he traveled safely. "I wouldn't want to set off all on my own," Stonesong confessed, giving Graywing a friendly nudge. "You're a brave cat." Hollow Tree nodded. "We'll be thinking of you." Graywing didn't feel brave. Now that it was time to leave, his belly churned with apprehension. But he had no choice. Jagged Peak needed him. Among the gathered cats, he spotted Dewyleaf. "Do you want to come?" he asked her. "It's your last chance to be with Moonshadow again." Dewyleaf hesitated, glancing at her rounded belly, then shook her head. "My kits belong in the mountains," she replied, her tone not bitter, but resigned. "And I think things will be better here now. But when you see Moonshadow, tell him I hope he's happy in his new home." "I will," Graywing promised. Misty Water nudged her way to the front of the crowd. "Don't forget the route I showed you," she mewed. "Over those boulders and around the side of the mountain." "I know." Graywing dipped his head respectfully. "We wouldn't know where Jagged Peak went if it wasn't for you." Misty Water gave a satisfied snort. Quiet Rain was the last cat to step forward. I'll come with you a little way, she murmured, giving Greywing's ear a lick. With a final farewell to the other cats, Greywing led the way out into the open. Quiet Rain padded softly behind him. On the mountainside, the dawn light was still gray and dim, the sky covered with clouds, though gathering brightness on the horizon showed where the sun would rise. A stiff breeze blew low snow into their faces. I cannot speak. Together, Greywing and Jagged Peak climbed the rocks toward the plateau, halting beside the boulders where Jagged Peak had veered aside. Wait here a moment, Greywing murmured, before scrambling up the rest of the way and heading across to the heap of stones that showed where Fluttering Bird was buried. I don't know if you can still hear or see me, Greywing whispered, bowing his head, but I promise I will never forget you. After a couple of heartbeats, he turned away and clambered back to his mother. Side by side, they skirted the boulders and made their way along the ledge where they had last seen Shaded Moss and his companions. Greywing had been afraid that the fresh snow would have blotted out the trail, but here and there, in crevices where little snow could reach, he picked up traces of the traveling cats and Jagged Peak's fresh scent lying on top. He did come this way, Quiet Rain mewed, sounding a little encouraged. Jagged Peak's faint scent led them around the flank of a mountain. A shiver ran through Greywing from ears to tail tip as he glanced back, taking one last look at the waterfall. For a little while their surroundings were still familiar from hunting expeditions, but well before sun high they were padding into new territory, where every paw step felt strange. The trail began to lead into a valley, and he heard the sound of a river. He halted on the bank with Quiet Rain at his side and looked out across a fierce, tumbling torrent, pouring steeply down the side of the mountain. A cobweb-thin casing of ice stretched from bank to bank, with dark water gurgling along underneath. The ice will only take one cat across, Quiet Rain mewed. This is where my journey ends. Though her voice was calm, grief welled up in her eyes, and Greywing knew how hard it must be for her to bid goodbye to her last kit. He pressed against her side, twining his tail with hers and parting his jaws to draw on her scent. I'll find Jagged Peak, he promised, and I'll never let him in Clear Sky forget our home. Quiet Rain let out a long sigh, then nudged him away. Go quickly, she told him, before the sun rises higher and melts the ice. With a final goodbye, Greywing stepped out onto the ice, uncomfortably aware of how fragile it was. If it gave way, the turbulent water would sweep him down the mountain to a certain death on the rocks below. He placed one paw after another cautiously, not daring to stop or look back. He just kept his gaze fixed on the safety of the rocks at the other side. Then there was an ominous creaking underpaw. Quiet Rain screeched, "Run!" Greywing sprang forward, hurling himself at the opposite bank. Behind him he heard the ice give way and fall into the river. Spray boiled up from the thunderous water, blotting out the firm ground ahead. His forepaws landed on rock just as the ice finally shattered, and he felt freezing water surge around his hindquarters. Scrabbling frantically, he dragged himself to safety and whirled, peering through the spray for Quiet Rain on the opposite bank, but the mist had risen between them, and he couldn't see her. "I'm alive!" he yelled as loudly as he could. For a few heartbeats, he ran up and down the bank, trying to get a clear view of his mother, but the water was too fierce, the spray too thick, and every moment he risked losing his balance on the slippery rocks and plunging into the torrent. "Goodbye," he yelled again, hoping that Quiet Rain could hear him. He could hardly bear the thought that she might believe he was dead too. "I won't forget you, or the mountains." Turning away from the river, Greywing tried to work out where he should go next. The sun was only a pale disk behind the clouds, hardly enough to guide him. "I'll just have to hope that Jagged Peak came this way too," he thought. By sun-high, Greywing needed to rest. His paws ached. "I've never traveled so far in my life," he muttered as he looked for a sheltered spot. And maybe that's the problem, he thought. We've always hunted close to home. We might have found more prey if we'd spread out our search a bit wider. Not that I've seen much prey out here. The breeze stiffened and became an icy wind, swirling up loose snow. Greywing dived thankfully into shelter under a split rock. Familiar scents wrapped around him as he flopped down. The other cats were here, but he couldn't detect Jagged Peak's scent among the others. It should be stronger and fresher than the rest, but I can't pick it up at all. He cast his mind back to the iced-over river. Jagged Peak had no experience of walking on ice. Maybe he was too afraid to try. Greywing wondered if Jagged Peak had headed into the valley instead, trying to find a safer place to cross. Determination to find his brother flooded through him. He forced his way into the wind again. There was no fresh snow falling, only sharp flakes tossed up by the gale. His fur flattened to his sides. Greywing blinked as he peered down into the valley, then up the trail where the other cats had gone. He knew they might be close. I can't go on up the trail without looking for Jagged Peak first. Greywing plunged down the slope as fast as he could, bounding from boulder to boulder. In his haste, he landed clumsily and slipped, letting out a hiss of pain as skin scraped off one of his pads. Agony shot up his leg, but after a few limping paw steps, the cold numbed his injury. To his relief, the wind dropped as he reached the valley. A broad stretch of ground lay in front of him, riddled with deep-set streams and scattered with boulders. A few stunted trees and bushes poked up through the snow. Feeling hunger gnawing at his belly, Greywing stayed alert for signs of prey, as well as traces of Jagged Peak's scent, but he found nothing of either. All he could see was the body of an old snow hare lying under a bush. Disgusting! His nose wrinkled as he sniffed it. A cat eats fresh prey, not buzzard food. But with nothing else to quiet his growling belly, he forced himself to bite into the frozen flesh. When he could force down no more, his belly feeling chilled and uncomfortable, Greywing studied the valley, looking back in the direction he had come. He could see the river crashing down the mountainside, and wondered if Jagged Peak could be behind him now. His little brother might have taken a long time to work his way down among the rocks at the river's edge. Greywing began to head up the valley, but it was slow going because he had to wind around so many boulders. Limping and frustrated, he glanced around to find the biggest one and scrambled on top of it. From his vantage point, he could scan the valley in both directions. There was no sign of Jagged Peak between him and the river, but his brother was small enough to be hidden amongst the boulders. Turning to look along the valley in the direction the traveling cats would have headed, Greywing saw that it was empty too, except for a flicker of movement above as an eagle swooped from a crag. His gaze tracked its flight closely, trying to spot where its prey was hiding. If it misses, I might be able to catch the prey later, he thought. The eagle flung itself down, and Greywing heard a screech of fury as it came up again empty-clawed. Beneath the screech, Greywing thought he could make out a faint yowl. His heart slammed into his throat. Jagged Peak? Greywing leaped from the boulder, ignoring his injured pad as the wound broke open, and raced toward the eagle, which had begun another dive. As he drew closer, he saw that the bird was young, with soft feathers around its face and legs. Good, that means it'll be easier to deal with. As he scrambled desperately among the rocks, Greywing could hear the panic-stricken caterwauling more clearly. "Leave me alone! Help!" "I'm coming," Greywing yelled in reply. "Hold on!" The eagle had alighted on a rock and was reaching down with one claw, trying to grab Jagged Peak from a narrow crevice below. Greywing could just make out the tips of his brother's ears and realized that he was trapped in the tiny space. "I'll have to distract the eagle so that Jagged Peak can escape." Greywing sprang forward and crouched in front of the bird, his lips drawn back. The eagle flapped awkwardly around to fix its beady yellow eyes on him. It lunged, squawking. Greywing tried to dodge aside, but his injured paw made him stumble. With a stab of panic, he felt the bird's talons fasten in the loose fur at his neck. He thrashed to free himself and fell back among the rocks, but before he could struggle to his paws, the eagle beat its mighty wings and grabbed hold of him again. "Greywing, I'm coming!" Greywing heard his brother shriek and caught a glimpse of Jagged Peak scrambling out of the crack, fearlessly launching himself at the eagle. The bird flapped madly against the weight of the two cats, and Greywing felt himself lifted from the ground. The pain in his neck was shooting through all his body, and a red mist covered his eyes. He struggled to stay conscious. Then he felt the eagle let go with one talon to grab at Jagged Peak. "Ha!" he thought. "Mistake, greedy belly." He managed to twist around with batter at the eagle's underbelly with his hind legs. With a screech, the bird released him, and he plunged downward to hit the rocks with a bone-jarring crash. Looking up, Greywing saw Jagged Peak hanging onto the eagle's wing with his claws. "Jagged Peak, let go!" he yelled. Jagged Peak glanced at the ground, then unhooked his claws and fell back onto the stones. The eagle swooped toward them again with another furious screech. With a heartbeat to spare, Greywing shoved Jagged Peak into the space between two rocks. They cowered there in a tiny gap while the eagle shrieked overhead. Jagged Peak was trembling from pain and fear, looking nothing more than a kit. Greywing curled his body around him and soothed him with long, slow licks. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe now. I found you." Once again, if you want to hear about my Evil Grey Stripes, aka Evil Grey Star AU, just say so in the comments. Lick, subscribe, and you guys are welcome. Bye.